Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. Please look at me as the light entertainment before lunch. Now, as Gideon mentioned actually in his opening comments, we are to some extent a country of contradictions. We have got some excellent science going on in this country, particularly environmental science. But in spite of that, we note that the environment is still in a parlous state. We know that biodiversity is in decline and many other aspects of natural capital are in decline. But in fact, we are in the bottom 10% in terms of biodiversity for the intactness of our biodiversity, and we're at the bottom of the G7 as well. So that's a really poor record in terms of biodiversity. Of course, that's only one aspect of natural capital. But again, on the positive side, we are one of the best monitored countries in the world. We have tracked that decline very well. So clearly, what we've been doing in the past few decades has not been working or has not been enough. And it's largely a matter of scale. We're not doing things at a landscape scale. So I think it's really incumbent upon landowning organisations like the National Trust to really grasp this issue. We own about 1.5% of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. But it's not just us. We work in partnership with a whole host of other major landowners. We sit on the major landowners group. And this includes the Crown Estate, RSPB, DEFRA and its arm's length bodies. We're doing less work actually with the Forestry Commission and MOD, and they are also really massive landowners. I'm going to take you back in time now to the Natural Capital Committee's kind of conceptual framework, which, of course, the NCEA has really kind of grasped and brought to life, that natural capital assets are the assets from which ecosystem services flow and provide benefits for people. And that it's through that lens of broad habitats that those different aspects of natural capital come together and interact to produce that wide variety of benefits. And there are three characteristics, of course, of those broad habitats. As embodied in the Lawton Principles, it's the extent of a broad habitat, its quality, and its spatial configuration in the landscape, and its connectedness in the landscape that influences that flow from natural capital to benefits. And again, sort of referring to a historical document, I did some work with Georgina May, so this is now out of date. It's 10 years ago, where we actually looked at, we commissioned a piece of work, and it broad habitats in terms of how they are delivering those benefits to people, and produced this kind of draft natural capital risk register. You can see that it's out of date because at the time the assessment, for example, for woodlands was that quantity was sufficient to produce the benefit of equable climate. But of course, now we will probably have a different view in that analysis suggests we should have 18%, 17 or 18% cover rather than 13%. But the NCEA is going to provide the sorts of data that is going to allow us to recreate this risk register much more effectively, accurately, and up to date. So essentially, it lists the idea was it lists the major risks to benefits from natural capital through that lens of land use. So actually, as the National Trust thinks about its new strategy, it is also, we're trying to embed it in this framework. And those 3 landscape scale metrics, quantity, quality, and connectivity of habitat, are at a high level one of the outcomes that we aim to really contribute to over the next decade. And quality, of course, then you need to break that down into the different elements in terms of the natural capital assets in different habitats. And the NCEA actually provides the framework which can not only tie these 3 tiers together across England in the first instance, but can actually also tie together these elements across different organisations' strategies. And as we think about those building blocks in the middle tier, we are looking to the Environmental Improvement Plan, which of course is being reviewed at the moment, but the headlines, of course, are constant and relevant and remain. And in the EIP, we have quantitative targets for different aspects of natural capital. So we realized that we needed a theory of change within the National Trust, how we're going to change our land use over the next decade. And actually I was asked to put, okay, Rosie, you want a theory of change? Put it on a page. Well, I did actually manage to put it on a page. It was A3 and the print was quite small. But here are the headlines, just the headlines. And I just want to draw out 4 elements. The first being, of course, the situation, the nature and climate crisis that we find ourselves in. That is the starting point. And the second is we are looking to those metrics in the EIP as to, really working out what our contribution to those metrics are going to be. And I just want to draw out 2 elements from the middle bit: partnerships and also large-scale interventions. And these are 2 core pillars in how we actually hope to do this and make our contribution. So we're developing our strategic measurement framework for the next decade. We are defining the data pool from which we will draw some simple measures, some composite measures that will feed into our organisational health, our strategic KPIs, and our wider impact measures. And we're looking to how they align to those external targets that we want to contribute to. For example, the Environment Improvement Plan. So just to illustrate how this is going to perhaps play out for nature, this is draft in confidence because this is very much work in progress. But we are looking in our data pool to aligning what we measure with the NCEA around area, condition, connectivity of habitats, and then various species data. We feed those in. We're going to feed those into specific KPIs, which we are currently debating. And we're aligning those KPIs with targets in the Environment Improvement Plan. So we're drawing up a new nature monitoring framework, and we're doing that along guidelines which are very similar to those kind of guidelines that have constructed the NCEA. Yes, we are looking at cost effectiveness, and particularly as a charity, always have to justify all the money we spend in terms of charitable funds. So we want to make the greatest use of existing data sources, but also in particular, the NCEA is going to provide us with a counterfactual for what is going on our land versus off our land. Sometimes the questions we want to ask as an organisation are going to require us not just simply to facilitate NCEA sampling on our land, but actually to supplement it so that we can really get the power in the sample size to make those comparisons. So we're aligning as closely as possible to the NCEA. There's much greater power if we are all using standard metrics and protocols. And also, just to give you an example of some of the large-scale interventions we are planning, we've actually drawn together a number of existing spatial data sets, and of course in the future the NCEA spatial data will allow us to do this even more effectively, to actually look at where on our land we have the greatest opportunity for uplift in natural capital. Over 40 data sets, and then we interrogated those maps, and we arrived at 17 places where we have several hundred hectares of land where we will be making significant land use change. So we're working now with those property portfolios to ensure that we have the appropriate plans, visions, and monitoring in place to deliver that change. But we also want those nature accelerators to act as ink blots in the landscape. We are working with other partners where we can really connect up what we're doing at a landscape scale and turn that dial, particularly in connectivity. And we also think by collaborating at the landscape scale that we're going to be able to unlock the kind of green finance investment that we're going to need to make the change that is required. And there's a lot of work to do. This is a map which was drawn up last December. The red areas showing areas in England which we think will contribute to 30 by 30, and the blue areas are the areas with great potential to contribute. So you can see that there is a lot to do to get from where we are at the moment to where we actually need to be, particularly if we're going to deliver 30 by 30 by 2030. So we're working on next steps for the community of landowners. We've actually talked about this for the last couple of decades, but it really is time to act now, not only because of the nature and climate crisis, but also because, of course, nature markets are now developing at a pace. And if we don't have good quality data for those nature markets to use, they will still develop and they will use poor quality data. So this is absolutely crucial. We're working with others to develop monitoring strategies that align with the NCEA as close as possible. And in fact, next week, my team are holding a workshop at the Wellcome Trust with a number of other landowners and stakeholders to really kind of draw this agenda together. The workshop's called Pushing On to Build a Better Nature Evidence Base. And one of the key planks there is actually, really giving the NCEA legs into the future. And also, of course, working with DEFRA in many different ways. And I know that DEFRA has thought of all of these elements, and we've heard about quite a few of these already. But I think we certainly need to incentivize some key funders in the environmental space to also align with the NCEA. For example, the National Lottery Heritage Fund spends millions of pounds in the natural environment every year. And it would be great if they would require projects to report in a kind of NCEA compliant way, rather than reinventing how we're evaluating success. Also, there are, the NCA is not the only show in town. There are other data platforms as well. I mean, a very notable one being the NBN, the Biodiversity Network. We need to have interoperability and we need to share data and make sure that we are making the most of all the evidence that is collected in these different ways. We've already discussed that we need ecological coherence across the devolved administration. And also, we've just seen a great example of the utility of the NCEA through evaluating the ELMS programme. But we could actually use these data to evaluate other policies and programmes into the future. For example, how are we going to assess the success of the protected landscape management plans? The NCEA could provide a framework for that as well. So, just to conclude, I sincerely hope this isn't just a kind of a snapshot of the baseline. We really do need to, I think, act together to give this framework longevity and ensure it reaches its full potential. And I sincerely hope that we can do that. There is a broad and strong coalition of organisations who actually wish to work with DEFRA to help it fulfil its potential in this space. Thank you very much.
Shall we sit down now and then I'll take some questions from the audience. So we've got a Slido running. It's a different code from the previous session. So if you could enter any questions you've got on Slido. And we've also got some roving mics. So if anyone would like to ask a question from Rosie or from myself, then please, now's your chance. Okay, first hand up over there.
Hi, Tara Hooper, Natural England. I work on the marine side of the programme. And we've actually got a report coming out, if not today, any day soon, where we interviewed a lot of people involved in practical restoration activities in the marine environment. And I think we have an even smaller understanding there of what works, what doesn't work, and particularly what the cost effectiveness of any of these interventions are. So I wanted to come back to that first point you made about how do we better persuade funders to understand the really long-term needs in terms of monitoring so that we can properly get that evidence as to what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think funders probably do realise it. They just don't think they can necessarily afford it. And so that is where, the NCEA can provide a framework where if everyone is actually monitoring in the same way, if we can actually get funders to say, yes, well, you're part of the requirement of doing this project, of having this funding, is that you collect these data using these protocols and these standards, then it's continually adding to the strength of the evidence base. It's the cost-effective way to do it. But I agree that the challenges in the marine environment are more acute, much more acute.
Okay, thank you. A question from Rob at the front.
Hi, Rosie. Thank you for that. So the National Trust has two massive strengths. One, as you say, it's a big landowner. But two, it's an organisation that brings people right into those ecosystems. So a couple of questions, if I may. First, what are you learning? There's a beautiful example just above your head. What are you learning about this issue of increasing access while protecting? We know that recreational value is enormous out of our ecosystems, and you're one of the organisations that enables that. So what can we all learn together about that difficult sometimes balance? And the second question is the question that was thrown at our panel to start with. From your perspective and from the people who visit the National Trust, does this natural capital thinking work? Do you get them complaining that it's all a bit messy now and that you're flooding bits of your land? What's the sort of response you're getting from people? Okay,
that's good. I'll try and remember both parts to that. But to answer your first part, I could illustrate it with something that we have going, which is the Dogs Project. So people love to come to National Trust places and walk their dog, which is great. I mean, you know, part of our purpose is providing that space for people. But of course, sometimes it's important that the dog is on a lead. So we have a program where we talk about the facilities for dog walkers, where they can walk their dog off the lead, where perhaps we would prefer that we ask them to put the dog on the lead, and where actually we would rather dogs don't go at all. So in that way, just sort of explaining, facilitating what they want to do, explaining why we don't want them to do it in other places, and actually providing facilities. And apparently there are, 1, 2, or 3 paw prints or something for a property now, depending upon the level of facilities for dogs. So, in that way, it's sort of working with people, and that approach has proved very successful. Now I've forgotten the second half of the question. No.
Natural capital. Do people
Yes, okay, right. So National Trust has nearly 6 million members, but also people, a lot of people who just visit the outdoor spaces anyway. And we have, in the past, got some insights into our membership, and it's hugely varied. There are most definitely the people who are very clued into the outdoors. They understand natural capital, they understand what we're doing in a lot of these cases, through to those people who really just want to visit the historic mansion and have a scone in the tea shop. And yes, we do have quite a lot of pushback from some of those people, it's quite a live issue for us. It does take up quite a lot of our time and energy simply responding to those and constantly explaining what we're about.
So there's a question on Slido that sort of naturally follows on from that. And you talked about in your presentation that you've got a massive estate, and the question is, how do you identify the best places to enhance and grow natural capital with that huge estate? Well,
so that's really part of the opportunity mapping work I was talking about. So it's making use. We're quite a data-rich country in that you have the Natural England data on where there are opportunities to restore habitats. You have data from the Environment Agency about where there are good places to work with natural processes for flood alleviation, etc. You can then combine that with local knowledge. But there will always be choices to be made. And one of the things that we have committed to doing is establishing 20 million trees. And actually we're finding that we made that commitment in 2020. We said we're going to establish 20 million trees by 2030. So we're nearly halfway through. Nowhere near there. Nowhere near. So there are choices to be made, and it really can be quite challenging. You have to make choices between different priorities. We also have a lot of archaeology and land of heritage value. We need to balance that. So it's kind of just facing into those choices really, and being. Working across the disciplinary boundaries, and being, really clear about what your priorities are.
Mm-hmm. And that leads on to another question from Slido, and then I'll hand over to Gideon. But about there's a range of metrics. Biodiversity is inherently quite difficult to sort of say that's the metric to target. What are your thoughts around, the key metrics that we ought to be looking at?
Well, in some ways. I think that's why the environmental improvement plan is so helpful, because if you can actually point to a piece of work where a lot of really intelligent people have done some thinking to really guide you, then that is hugely useful. But there is something of a debate going on in the nature conservation world at the moment, in that in the past the focus has been on endangered species, and they are still, it's still incredibly important that we undertake the evidence-based actions to try and protect those species. But actually, I think we need. It's not been enough. So I think, in the next decade, it really is about how we're going to deliver those wider public benefits from transforming landscapes, doing things at scale. And that's where I think the monitoring of natural capital more broadly is going to be so important. So, it's not just the endangered species, it's also the common species.
Thank you. Can we take the mic there over to Gideon?
Thank you. For a comment first and then a question for Rosie. The comment was in response to the previous question about longevity of funding. I agree with you, Rosie, that the problem is often that funders just simply can't afford it, that they recognise the importance. So my two answers to that question would be, we need a diversity of funders. I think you touched on that as well. But we also need to make the monitoring cheaper. We simply cannot afford to carry on spending the amount of money we are on monitoring and still increase where we need to monitor more. So there's a challenge there. But I had a question for you. I really welcome the closer working between the large landowners and the NCA programme. It's a great process you're going through, so thank you. You talked a lot about sort of aligning the way you want to make the measurements and the type of measurements. You didn't talk so much about the alignment of the data, making data available side of it. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what you're going to do with your monitoring data to make it available and how we should integrate more, both NCA and the large landowners, but more broadly across the data landscape to make it available to people who need it.
It's a really good point. And, our data will be openly available, but, it's about how, and in fact, actually, it's another thing which we're trying to build up almost really from ground zero within the National Trust. I've got a new initiative that's actually looking at, it's called Data for Nature, to really develop, just the basic data management standards and practices and data science within the Trust. But our aim would be for all the data that we collect, there needs to be a two-way flow. We need to draw on the NCEA data and we want to provide as well. So that kind of interoperability between different organisations, I think, is going to be hugely important. Yeah. And we're going to have to work out the GDPR issues in that context.
Yeah. And you're usefully organising that meeting next week at the Wellcome Trust, which I'm attending. Obviously, the NCA is going to release all its data via open government licence. We've got a set of standards, a set of protocols for all sorts of sampling, whether it be soil or landscapes. Yeah. So I think the opportunity for us to share all of that and sort of start setting a national, potentially an international standard is the time is ripe.
Absolutely.
And earlier on I was talking to somebody from Scotland, and I think there's a real interest again about sort of looking beyond the boundaries of England and looking at a national and even international level. So I think, it's a good way forward. And at this point, I've been told that I should wrap up and invite everyone to take lunch, which is going to be served in the rooms that you were in earlier. There's also a series of posters up there. Each of the posters is going to be manned by people from the NCA programme. So really do take that opportunity to have a look, find out more about the programme, how you might use the data. And of course, please enjoy speaking to your like-minded fellows around this conference centre and have some fun and make some contacts. Thank you very much.